Welcome to Refuel. I'm your host, Corey McLean, and this is the show where I sit down with entrepreneurs and creatives to find out how they do their work and what makes them tick. In this episode, I sit down with Kirk-Anthony Hamilton. Kirk, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So, first question to you is, who are you and what do you do?
So I'm Kirk-Anthony Hamilton, entrepreneur from Kingston, Jamaica. I'm in the space of investment and investment promotion, primarily curating groups of entrepreneurs, investors, innovators, and big media from around the world to come and enter the Caribbean market with a look towards generating new opportunities.
I've seen you refer to yourself as a community curator. So that's the first question I had for you. So describe being a community curator and how do you even become a community curator?
Okay. For the first part, a community curator essentially pulls together people around a purpose or cause, right? So my purpose is, this vision of a new Caribbean, economically vibrant Caribbean. And so what we've managed to do is build out a global group or community of individuals who are interested in that vision of a new Caribbean and participating in building the kind of enterprises that will result in such. Simply a more thriving, prosperous Caribbean where people can live out more meaningful lives. Essentially being able to pursue their dreams. And another thing we haven't done too well with in the region is I believe in the value of globalization, but I also believe in local benefit. What we haven't done as well as I think we could do is this idea of partnership. So global investors come into a market and actually help to create wealth on the ground and leave something for those who actually live here. We have been a scenario more of, on the worst case, some people would call exploitation, right? In the sense of organizations and individuals being able to come in, set up shop, because of their access to resources, capital, etc., and maybe business know-how, marketing ability, etc., come in and very quickly take advantage of resting opportunities that many people here see, but maybe can't take advantage of, and then extract that capital to somewhere else in the world once they've created a profitable result. That has been the story of the Caribbean when it comes to international investment in many cases, right? Exactly, in terms of how the international business sector has operated here. How do you get local players to start participating at a greater level?
Okay, so you're looking at investment in the Caribbean, but not just from an external to internal financial investment. You're looking at also an interplay where the Caribbean people get to participate. It's
yes.
More of a partnership, a hand-holding, handshaking thing.
For sure.
Okay. Talk to me about Tech Beach.
Okay. Tech Beach is however you want to look at it. We call it a platform. It's a community that we've built of tech entrepreneurs, innovators, investors, both regional and global, who come together around conversations on various emerging technologies, including blockchain technology, artificial intelligence, other technologies within the fintech space, deep learning, machine learning, that kind of subject matter. So very typically high level and new age technologies, but come together to discuss where the opportunities lie from a global standpoint with these various areas of tech, and I guess the unique thing about it is that it's a very global community with an extremely global narrative that happens to convene within the Caribbean region. And the difference between us and any other community, as I usually tell, especially the global players who we invite to participate, is that we actually are based in the Caribbean. We care about the Caribbean, and so we invite Caribbean people to participate. And a major part of the goal is designed around unlocking opportunities for Caribbean people, right? So, you know, we try to not have the conversation be too much focused or narrowed down on the niche that is the Caribbean region, right? We talk about how businesses are built from a global standpoint, but there is always a leaning towards, you know, how can this then benefit this part of the world?
Okay, so as you put it, Tech Beach is in the Caribbean.
Yes.
But it's not necessarily. But it's okay. So it's in the Caribbean, but it's not just a Caribbean-based tech conference platform thing. Okay, because that was one of my questions. Was this happening in Jamaica? Was this something that was there that you were exploiting, or was it that you used Jamaica as the location for it and then pulled the components together? Was there a mini Silicon Valley happening in Jamaica? Because from the outside looking in,
Yeah.
it looks like all of a sudden Jamaica is like the tech hub of the Caribbean.
I would argue that there were obviously businesses in Jamaica that were either tech-based or tech-enabled, trying to get somewhere. No doubt, maybe more than in many places in the region. I would be hard-pressed to call anywhere in the Caribbean a tech hub as such, just because that's not reality, right? And so what we set out to do with Tech Beach, and I would say maybe I have achieved and will continue to better on, is shining a light on the fact that not only is innovation happening here, but that innovation is possible here. Because for me, you know, I always say to people, my outlook is very simple. I don't look at this place as what it is, but what it could be. And so when it comes to tech, why is there not a proliferation of thriving tech startups in the Caribbean? It's not for a lack of people wanting to achieve this, and it's not for a lack of, you know, talent out there, right? It is simply that there's certain dynamics in the region when it comes to capital, other resources, access to the market, mindset, as well as, you know, in some cases, know-how. And I would argue most importantly, you know, Silicon Valley wasn't built in a day.
Yes.
Right.
Would you say then that it's more a situation where you need to build the ecosystem for tech and, well, business in general to thrive, entrepreneurship in general to thrive, rather than necessarily saying, well, it just happens? Silicon Valley thrives because there are so many things happening in the environment that is someplace where people go to do that kind of stuff. And the fact that you can look and see your neighbors doing this and you see somebody else, you then can draw on that inspiration. You can draw on the fact that, well, I'm not doing it on my own. Mm-hmm. That it has been done and this precedent set, so you can keep it.
Yeah.
Okay. So you say you don't necessarily need to leave the Caribbean to go to such a place.
Well, what I would say is I think that everything happens in conjunction. So Silicon Valley thrives because there was a wave of advancement that people took advantage of and created wealth with, which was the age of silicon, right? And the somewhat birth of the computer age that lined the pockets of a lot of people who then look back and said, this is how I benefited. My form of giving back is going to be investment in others, right? Instead of the normal charitable route. And so that is how Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley. That cannot be recreated. And one of the challenges with emerging market capitalism is a lot of times people look on at what has been achieved elsewhere and try to mimic it. But what you'll never be able to mimic is the process, right?
I think the focus needs to be more on a nurturing environment, as ecosystem where you can interact with others,
yes,
and learn from. Because I'm a Steve Jobs fanboy,
yes,
right? And when I read this basically story that he, as a young boy, wanted parts to tinker with to build a computer, and he got them from the Hewlett Packard factory, not because he had to fly across the country, but Hewlett Packard was in his neighborhood, and more importantly, he got them from, it was either Hewlett or Packard himself, right? And that story, the fact that was possible, that there was a person that you could reach out to, and who was willing to reach out.
Yes. So what I'd say is, to that point of, for me, I think emerging market capitalism has to be rethought from a simple standpoint. People tend to look at advanced economies and decide that, we as Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, or anywhere else in the world that has emerging market characteristics should all of a sudden just be this place, right? Which is not reality. I think that things have to happen in conjunction. So on one end, we are playing this role of kind of building a foundation, being a catalyst towards driving somewhat of an entrepreneurship and innovation revolution, pushing people to accept innovation, embrace innovation, as well as bringing certain resources to the table that people can leverage to build these kind of businesses, right? At the same time, it will take effort on another end to get people to start accepting these products that people are building, right? Utilizing them, paying for it, so that people can build wealth, right? And for people, for products designed within this region to be accepted on a global scale as high quality, right? And that's a narrative that is also important. And so, in the same breath, people have to be trying to build these businesses, right? Some will fail. They'll fail because they, in some cases, don't know what they're doing. In some cases, because the market isn't ready, right? And maybe a host of other reasons. But the reality is that these things all will have to happen at the same time. You will see success stories emerge. In Barbados, case in point, I always, look to BIT, right, as an example of a very unlikely outcome based on the dynamics of the region, but a very promising outcome. And the goal now is to see where the market can look at something like a BIT and say, that happened, can more of this happen? Yes.
So the fact that there now is precedent that indigenous, tech-based, alternate type business can grow in the Caribbean.
Yes, it's happened. Yes. Everything I've built has been a combination of my experiences and exposure, right? So, in no way discounting whether or not they're innovative. Nothing, in the modern world, there are those who will argue that nothing is typically completely new, right? And so what we've done is simply contextualized a model to an extent that has actually worked in other markets, right? In this case, I'm 31 years old. I grew up between, I grew up in Jamaica, moved to Barbados, and then actually went on to the States. And in the 27 years that I existed before starting this stuff, looking at Jamaica, there was just never a time where the economy was doing well. And, you hear people talk about various ways to drive the economy and drive growth and such like that. And on the other end, you constantly hear about businesses failing and such like that. And I, from a young age, was very passionate about business and entrepreneurship and such like that. And the idea that the critical components to achieving a certain level of success were likely missing just didn't sit well with me. So I kind of rethought my approach, right? It's hard to sum up everything and try to dispel any kind of formula around, how you conceive these things, right? What I would argue for folks to understand in terms of what we're pursuing, if anything is different about it and if people see value in it, is that, a big part of it comes from the exposure I had even going to college. So I went to college in Savannah, Georgia at an art and design school called SCAD. Essentially I went to school with a group of people who arguably would not be given much of a place in the Caribbean, right? So numerous hippies, goths, all that, people who exist on a fringe. And as a Caribbean individual, growing up with the rigidity of the Caribbean education system and mindset, etc., I had to learn to accept those people and be open to the fact that, despite them being different, they are valuable. Right. And so one of the things I always said to people is I studied architecture. I can always reflect on my time in studio where I always presented these very practical, kind of straightforward, well-presented ideas, right? And graduated from college with flying colors. But one of the things that impacted me, and I realized it kind of after the fact, was I used to sit down in these studios at the same time and listen to some of my peers and counterparts present what I would have thought at the time were just ridiculous, crazy ideas. Just off the wall, impractical, why are you doing this, you're wasting time, kind of thing. That was my initial headspace around these things. As I look back on it though, what I took away was that what these guys were doing was they were designing with the mindset that said, you know what, I don't know how this can happen, but I know I want it to happen. And so I'm willing to put this vision out there first and then figure it out. That is not the way that we are kind of programmed in this region, right? And so that was one of the biggest contributors to, I would say, what I'm doing now, which is that because of that experience, I was able to take a step back, look on at what was happening in the market and say, you know what, there's some missing pieces to this. How do you rethink the way this market works? I have a friend from Jamaica who moved to Canada, and I always said to people, nowhere is utopia, right? But he was a doctor turned entrepreneur. We invested in his company. Eventually he sold it and he decided he wanted to move to Canada because he felt like, again, certain parts in the Caribbean were missing for him. Either way, one day he called me and we were talking, and he was just talking about, again, education in the Caribbean as someone who had never lived overseas before. And that, this idea of what pushes someone when you walk into an elevator to decide that this thing could work differently, right? Because that's how innovation happens. And in our market, that's not necessarily something that has been encouraged, right? You're not necessarily brought up with this idea that you are a controller of outcomes and you can essentially re-envision the way things happen, right? So what does it take for someone to really be able to go out with the idea of, airports work one way I want to do it completely different and make it more efficient, make it more profitable, etc., but completely rethink the way airports work, right? That is kind of the culture that we're hoping to foster, but that is also the kind of characteristics that were instilled in me when I went off to college elsewhere.
So it's the experience of being outside.
Exactly. And being, not only being exposed, but being forced to accept and integrate with others, right? And you know, I made mention of the idea of fringe, especially because it's one thing to integrate, it's another thing to integrate amongst those who are typically outcasted, right? At the school I went to, these are people who are extremely well embraced, right? And so they're not considered on the fringe. But as a Caribbean individual, when you walk in initially, you're like, whoa, hold on, what's going on there? Yeah. Until you start realizing, you know, this guy is not sitting by himself at lunch, right? There are people surrounding him. And so, you know, I won't say I made friends with everybody, but I did make friends with a lot of people, right? And learned to accept not only the differences with people, but their ideas, you know, the lives they chose to live, and how different people approach things, right, towards a similar outcome. Okay. Success in my world is well-being. At the end of the day, in the modern world, well-being often has a cost, right? But it really is just a matter of peace of mind, right? Being able to wake up every day comfortable with where you are and what you have done. And so that's different for everyone, right? For some people, it will result in billions in earnings. For some, it will result in acquiring a piece of property in St. Lucie, building a small home, and when 60 comes, you know, I go and reside there, and I really am not inclined to encounter too many other people, right? So for me, I obviously have, as an entrepreneur, I have my aspirations of building out a considerable organization that is able to move the needle in many ways, you know, not only when we have this conversation around economic development for the Caribbean, but, you know, move the needle in terms of people's lives, proliferating investment, being profitable and very successful in line with that kind of revenue-driven model of success for the organization. But then for me, you know, in the long term, just living a life with peace of mind, free of certain stresses and such like that. So I'm not there yet. I'm not where I see success as yet. I would say, far away off, in the sense that I'm still working to build something. I'm young enough to take on certain stress and such like that, and to have time in that regard. And so for the moment, you know, I'm uncomfortable, and the push is towards a certain level of comfort to feel okay.
So right? That's the future.
Yes.
Let's talk about the present.
Yes.
How do you achieve work-life balance now? Is there work-life balance? You say you're uncomfortable. What's that like, you know, and what do you actively do? Okay, so uncomfortable simply means I'm not satisfied with where I am, and when I look outside, I'm not satisfied with where things are at. So we still have a lot of work ahead of us, and it's not just me. There are a lot of people who have a lot of work to contribute to the goal that I have set out for myself. So a lot of engines have to click at the same time. You know, in terms of work-life balance, I would argue I have a reasonable sense of that. And one of the beautiful things about where we live and where we're from is that is much quicker achieved here than most places in the world, right? Exactly, because as we said earlier,
you can step outside in Barbados especially, and you're right at the beach. So if every day you can go to the beach after a stressful day, then that's fantastic. The thing of it is, as I mentioned earlier, people being able to get to that place where going to the beach is actually relaxing, and when they step away from the beach, they're not walking right back into a headache, right? So
you can come back refreshed.
Yeah, I've been fortunate with the line of business that I've chosen to be in, right? It is hospitality and travel driven, which obviously has its own air of kind of playfulness around it. So I always tell people, a lot of my meetings are very casual in terms of environment. I meet a lot of amazing people, right? And sometimes, there's a very thin line between work and play, right? So my work often results in a dinner meeting or a drink in a decent bar or something like that. And so that brings some level of peace of mind. I travel a lot. I usually tell people I'm not really hardly ever on vacation, quote unquote. But again, based on the nature of what I'm doing, oftentimes I end up in these relatively casual scenarios. So not just in terms of place either, right? Because if I'm in New York, exactly. So, I go around, I meet people, I get to learn about what they're doing, tour their organization, stuff like that. And so it brings a certain level of peace of mind to me. And so I do get a good sense of exactly work-life balance. I have a great family, right? Love my mother and father. I have a sister who lives in Jamaica. But on the end of sacrifice, etc., as an entrepreneur, I have a brother who lives in Australia with 3 kids, right, and a wife. And so, they're not people I see often. I was fortunate to go and spend 7 weeks with them earlier this year, or earlier in 2017. But then that was after a gap of years of not seeing them, right? And so, what I would say is also, again, on the entrepreneurial narrative, usually when I'm doing these things that would be fun and exciting, it does have a work component to it. I am meeting with someone or having a discussion, etc. I don't necessarily take on as many casual weekends as I see, some of my friends and people I know do on a regular basis, right? I've had periods where there were years where I did not make it to Barbados. And so that side of things is an area in life that, I think the sacrifice is to an extent worth it, but there's the part of me that increasingly just tries to ensure that I maintain some of these connections with certain people and take more time towards ensuring I encounter them and spend some time with them.
All right, so past now.
Mm-hmm.
Message to your 16-year-old self. All right, so then.
Wow. Okay. Just do it, right? There are ideas that I had when I was much younger that I sat on because of things like fear, right? Or just not knowing, right? And the mindset of just getting it done is one that I would look to instill in my younger self.
Okay.
I think, but just do it.
And I have one question that I need to ask you. It's more personal information.
Yeah, man.
How was it meeting Jack Dorsey and connecting with him and getting him to Jamaica?
Yeah. With Jack Dorsey, it was, first of all, one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had. Having him sit on stage with me and my business partner Kyle as something that we, conceptualized and built from the ground up was that's monumental, right? It's I would argue one of the ultimate goals of any entrepreneur, far beats any kind of monetary gain that we could have gotten. So we met him in the Bay Area, And it was totally serendipitous because what happened is we went to actually meet another guy who came to Tech Beach named Michael Montano, who is the director of engineering at Twitter, who happens to have Trinidadian roots. And that's how we got in touch with him. And for some reason, against the norm of Bay Area interaction, Michael decided to ask us to meet him downstairs Twitter office at a very small coffee shop where you couldn't even sit. But we walked into the coffee shop and there he was, just standing there. So, as he walked by to go from paying for his coffee to picking it up, and he paid for his coffee, right? I just said, hey Jack, he looked, and I asked him to come over, and he came, and again, it's a very small space. Yeah. So it's not like I'm reaching to him from 20 feet saying, come over here. But he came, and I shared a very simple narrative with him about what we were working to achieve on a different side to the Caribbean than what he was probably familiar with, and the fact that we thought that he could play a role in delivering an outcome. And he said, you know what, send me an email. And right as that interaction happened, funny enough, the guy who invited us to the meeting walked in. And I was like, oh, what's up, Jack? And he took a picture for us. And then something at that moment clicked with him where he was like, why did I invite you? Like, I don't know why I told you guys to come to this coffee shop. And I guess that's the beauty of serendipity. But as I said to people as well, the flip side of it is we spend a lot of time in the Bay Area. So they always talk about, I don't know if it's that luck equals preparation meeting opportunity or something like that. At the end of the day, we got lucky because we happened to be in the Bay Area. And we were in the Bay Area for a lot of time, right? So, when we're building out Tech Beach and these various things, we don't spend, a couple days. We're there weeks on end. My business partner, Kyle, especially visits a few times a year, right? And so that's how that happened. And, I say to people that, again, in low resource markets, people tend to have very low tolerance around whimsical ideals like serendipity, perseverance, passion, etc. It's hard to absorb those things, right? Exactly, the seeming fairy tale. But the reality of it is, I think the most successful outcomes that any of us ever have are serendipitous, right? That's what ends up meaning the most to you. Because if you're good at something, you get up and you go after it, right? And you kind of know what you're going to achieve. What ends up being the most kind of valuable and exciting outcomes are the ones that break you out of your comfort zone, where you think, this is not going to happen. I'm not going to get in here. Right? This person is not going to call me back. I'm not going to get this contract. Right? It's when those emails come to you where you're like, and so, I always just look at how often I can create serendipity.
Kirk, thank you.
Yeah, man.
Thanks for chatting with me. And thank you for watching Refuel. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.